All right. Good evening. It is Tuesday. We're at 7:55 p.m. here on the East Coast, if you're joining us from another part of the country. And if you are here with us here in Rhode Island, I hope that you are surviving this storm. We know that there are trees falling everywhere, kind of surge gust of wind earlier today, and then the sun came out, and then now the wind is back. So excuse us if you see the lights flashing in the background. We know that power has been going on and off. All right. Good evening. All right, sorry about that echo. But again, welcome to Pump Up the Volume, where we amplify the voices of communities and really try to tackle some of the most contentious issues facing the state of Rhode Island today, while also, as always, challenging the status quo and the establishment that oftentimes neglects, and intentionally, I would say, neglects communities and the needs of those communities. So with me today, as always, is Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town Podcast. Thank you so much, Bill. As well as
Always a pleasure.
Mr. Roberto Gonzalez from, yeah, thank you, Bill. As well as we have Mr. Roberto Gonzalez from Steambox Art, Rhode Island. So thanks again, Roberto. These are my co-hosts, but sadly we are missing one of our other co-hosts, Mr. Pat Ford, founder of the Coalition Radio Network. Due to some trees out there in northern Cumberland, Pat was unable to make the show today, but he will be in our thoughts. And he will likely be listening to what we're talking about today, regretting that he missed the show. So we can always, carry the conversation forward in future in future shows, Pat. But today, what we want to tackle, there's a lot going on in the world. I don't want to neglect the fact that we still are facing a pandemic. We have health equity issues. We have social justice issues that we're confronting on a daily basis. People are living with the stress of the downtrending economy, along with those other things. These are real issues, things that we've talked about in the past few weeks, and things that we may provide you with a brief update with today. But the bulk of our discussion, once you receive that update, will really be a focus on the fact that this is an election season, or we're in election season, and we have many candidates and organizations that are propping up candidates here in the blue state of Rhode Island that are attempting to differentiate themselves as on a spectrum of what they call progressivism. So we have Democrats, we have establishment Democrats, and then we have quote unquote progressive Democrats. But we want to challenge that today. We want to really understand what is progressivism, how are some candidates defining progressivism versus others, and what should you pay attention to when you are confronted with these candidates that are asking you to vote for them for a better, more hopeful, more future. The question is, do they have a pragmatic plan to get there? And we'll dive into that later in the discussion and get everyone's perspective around the table. But to start off the call, as always, Bill, if you can give us a rundown of what's transpired over the past week in terms of news. You are on the pulse of Rhode Island and as an independent media journalist, but just really as the journalist that's actually out there talking to people. So let us know what's going on.
Well, I appreciate it, and always a pleasure to be here on this program with each of you. And Pat Ford, hopefully you got a nice chainsaw. I can picture Pat Ford in the lumberjack hat, and out there chopping up wood tonight. Look, this is what we've been worried about, what we've been concerned about for weeks, if not months. We have a surge in cases here in Rhode Island, confirmed cases. And by the way, this is with delayed test results. This could be results as old as 2 weeks, based on what the health department told me last week. And now we see that the tri-state area, and in the last few minutes here, Massachusetts has instituted a quarantine requirement for Rhode Island residents. So we went from a position where optically we were doing pretty well to now, guess what? We're closer to Alabama than we are to Massachusetts in terms of the outside looking in. That's not good news for Governor Raimondo, who's probably staking any hopes of a vice presidential bid or certainly a cabinet bid on this. And it's certainly not good news for any of us here in Rhode Island from a health and equity standpoint, because Dr. Munoz, as you well know, the infrastructure has not been created to triage, to test properly, and to just in general manage this crisis in the urban core. Now, aside from the spike in numbers, aside from the spike in confirmed cases and whatever testing capacity we may have, we're also looking at a back to school goal of August 31st that the administration hasn't backed away from. We've been peppering her with questions about this every Wednesday. Look, it's going to be almost impossible to send kids back to school. The Johns Hopkins format or formula, I should say, for evaluating a state, which is different than the criteria that the state itself uses to evaluate percent positivity, puts Rhode Island over 5%. It's going to be really difficult for her to make the case that we should send kids back to school if Johns Hopkins is reporting over 5%. So not a good week optically. We've seen it coming. And by the way, these test results, they're old. As I just said, it's not as if yesterday we tested and, okay, this morning we wake up and find out we're at plus 5% positivity rate. This is going back. And if you look just anecdotally at the behaviors of people in places like Newport, Block Island, and Narragansett, you can clearly see that masking, social distancing, and other protocols are not being adhered to. There was plenty of online chatter and photographs shared of activities over the weekend in Narragansett, concerts going on. I mean, you've got a cruise boat that left Newport Harbor with 100 people on it for a Folk Fest weekend unofficial concert on a boat. Give me a break. This is the result of these kinds of actions, and it's not a huge shock, as we've been talking about in this program for the last month and a half.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Bill. I mean, I think it is important for everyone to recognize that we, again, this is a highly contagious infection. We know that even if you do not have symptoms, there are studies that are showing that you can still have lung damage, even as one of those individuals that are infected that survive it, but again, that don't experience what might be the traditional symptoms of, let's say, a cough. You can still have lung damage. You can still have kidney damage as well. So we don't understand the long-term effects. I would take this disease very seriously, even if I, were a young person. I relatively am, but even if you are a 21, 22-year-old, please consider that. Also, to your point, Bill, we don't have the infrastructure. We're on the Equity Council, Roberto and I. We are constantly, challenging the establishment to clearly define what operationally they have done to ensure that we can not only protect communities, but protect children as they're walking into schools with an appropriate testing system for kids, a turnover time that's reasonable, a contact tracing force that's able to equip those educational institutions with fast response. And we don't have an answer. What we have a lot of is, quote unquote, well, we're accountable to ourselves. And I have to say that was actually said in one of the meetings. We are accountable to ourselves. No, they are accountable to us. All right. We elect the officials hire their people, and then their people either execute or don't execute. And here in Rhode Island, we need better execution. And I think that's historically true. So, with that said, getting into leadership, getting into what it means to be a leader and what it means to have a practical plan and how, a path to implement that plan to ensure that we have an equitable system as it relates to healthcare, education, as well as, social justice issues. It's election season. We have a lot of people talking a big talk, a lot of people coming out of kind of left field saying that they're running for all the right reasons. But it's hard not to see that some of them have these strings attached to their back. And if you follow the strings, it doesn't take you long to get to other individuals that either work within the establishment or work outside of the establishment, let's say within nonprofit organizations that have historically leaned on the establishment. And so you see the interconnections, and then, what you notice is that there's a veil that's put in front of these individuals. And that veil is one of, I am progressive. And I am looking out for people. I am the future. And, I know that's great. That's fancy talk. But at the end of the day, what does that mean? What does progressivism mean? And so I don't want to be the one to start this discussion, but I am ready to address my perspective. But I do want to give the floor initially to my co-host here to kind of give their experiences. And maybe I think one of the more objective perspectives may even be Bill, because Bill, you're interviewing everyone, right? I mean, you've interviewed candidates across the political spectrum, people on the far right, people on the far left, people in the middle. With all of those experiences and interactions that you've had, I don't want to force you to compartmentalize different types of progressive, but it would be great to get some perspective on how people have kind of defined themselves, or their version of progressivism, I would say, right?
Absolutely. Well, Roberto, if you want to actually kick this off, and candidly off air, we were having a discussion about this, kind of building this from the ground up. Is it progressivism for the candidate's self interest, or is it progressivism for society at large? Right. I guess that's where I would turn to you to start the discussion.
While we continue to have a binary political system, progressivism, conservatism, whatever ism you're bringing up is going to continue to fit under the ones and zeros. It's going to continue to fit under the red and the blue. And to fit, sometimes it's a force fit. And if you're force fitting yourself, sometimes you're going to leave some of your ideals behind. And some of those ideals are going to be those progressive things that brought you to the table. Some of those things are going to be the progressive ideals that motivated you to run. Some of those things are going to be the progressive ideals that got your support from the community. And those things are being shed when it gets time for elections, when it gets time for donors, when it gets time to sit at the table with the rest of your red team or with the rest of your blue team. And those are some of the things that scare me. We were having an offline conversation because, being in the positions that the three of us are, we have a lot of relationships with a lot of these people who are on Team Red and Team Blue. And I'm finding that even with my friends and even with the people that I have a lot of respect for, it gets very scary because a lot of times you're so invested in countering red, or red is so invested in countering blue, that again, a lot of those things that make you respect these people gets lost in the process. And those are some of the things that I was worrying about. I'm being intentionally vague. I'm sorry. I'm not addressing like specific candidates in terms of your question. Like I know we were offline, but those are the things that kind of bring me down when I have high hopes in a friend who's starting to run.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Roberto. And it's fine to start vague. Soon enough, we're going to tease away at some of these platforms, and by virtue of that, people will have to kind of reflect on who we may be considering, right, in the election season. So, Bill, from your perspective, again, I mean, we see. Let me frame this. We see what we might call grassroots progressives, right? People coming up and they want change. They want more diversity. They want more color. But at the same time, there's a little bit of a libertarian sprinkle in there, right? They also want their rights. They also want freedom. They want economic opportunity. They don't want heavy tax burdens, especially when they're attempting to get out of poverty, right? And so you see that dynamic with some grassroots progressives. And then you see what I would kind of categorize as kind of establishment progressives or corporate progressives, whatever framework you want to put it in, but progressives that are coming in saying these are the policies that make you progressive, and you have to adhere to these policies. And the way that we implement them is by going through the traditional political channels and by implementing the accepted political strategies. Right? So it's within the framework of the existing kind of political landscape that change is happening, but it has more to do with the policies and the ideas that they represent. And I'm not saying that there is not overlap, but generally the approach of grassroots progressivism seems to be much more radical and also mixed in with some of those, again, economic opportunity ends, as compared to, again, the kind of corporate litmus test progressive is saying, these are the policies, this is exactly what you need to accept. Generally, it's not even about you or your economic opportunity. It's about the general well-being of our future. So, again, I guess we can see good in both, right, arguments if you frame it that way, but I think we lose something as well. So today what I'm trying to figure out is, how are people defining themselves? What are we seeing? And what are we gaining, but what are we losing?
Right. And if you're running for a statewide office or for federal office, how well do you understand the constituency, right? You need to understand who will elect you or at least attempt to elect you. And if you don't have a grasp on what can realistically carry you to victory, the pulse of the state, or even if you're in a local district, if you're running for dog catcher, you need to understand who it is that's going to elect you. So a lot of these policies that are deemed progressive, well, perhaps we may agree with many of them or all of them, depending on who you are, what you are. The notion that you can simply create a litmus test for, okay, you know, what are your environmental positions? What are your, your positions on school choice? What are your positions on whatever it may be? And go up and down and expect that to carry in every single market, for lack of a better term. That's not realistic. And so, what we've gotten to now is where progressivism is far less nimble than it ought to be. There are some candidates that are more, and again, not getting into names, but down in South County, there's a progressive candidate, a member of the Rhode Island political co-op, who came out and said, hey, look, you know what? My position on gun ownership rights is different than, Matt Brown's or something like that. It's actually, I'm aware of where I am potentially representing. In her case, it's Hopkinton and parts of Richmond. And I know that if I have any shot at this, then I can't walk around town saying that I'm going to take all your guns away. But a lot of the positions that this person brings would add more color, would add more diversity, and would, on an educational level, be moving in the direction we need to go. So it's not to say everyone who is a part of any of the umbrella groups here in the state are incapable of individual thought. But I think we've gotten to a point where, as you mentioned, that corporate progressivism is becoming far more of an important criteria to certain power brokers than an individual's actual thought process and how well they can represent their community. That's the danger I see. And of course, we also have the fact of the matter where today, we've got a situation where we have a longtime sitting U.S. congressman in James Langevin, who, look, there's going to be people who say, what has he done, the whole time he's in there? And you can make arguments all day long about whether or not Jim Langevin is too conservative for you. Some people would say somehow he's too liberal. But at the end of the day, he's entrenched, and he's going to be very difficult to beat. So if you're coming at Jim Langevin with a progressive agenda, you need to make sure it's one that is extremely representative of the people on the ground who are experiencing challenges of equity, access to healthcare, access to education, so on and so forth, and less of just a benign, hey, you know what, Jim Langevin's been there for a while and he's more conservative than my friends and I like, so you vote for me instead. And of course, I'm talking about Dylan Conley, who, look, nice kid and has an agenda that maybe in the future could pan out to political office. But if you're basing your run as a progressive simply on the notion that you're challenging the establishment, that's not enough. You need to be able to challenge the establishment on specific points where the establishment has left other people behind in the state.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good points, Bill. Roberto, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you feel like, so I'm going to use an example. In Pawtucket, we have several women of color running for office. They're not, falling in line or asking to be a member of the Rhode Island Co-op, right? They want to represent the Cape Verdean community in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And they have their own ideas about how best to do that. But when you talk about the need for diversity, the need for different perspectives, right, and for really, working families making their way into the political, environment so that they can influence policy changes and execution of these ideas, I don't see a coalition building around them. And so that leads me to be kind of concerned, right? I mean, what is it that is not progress about their running for office? Why isn't capital being funneled, right, to candidates that are the face of the future? And because if it's purely about ideology, it's purely about like substantively the idea, right, that those governing us should look like us, then why aren't they receiving the support that they should be receiving? So with that question, Roberto, I mean, do you think that people are just using this word, that they're a progressive as just a way to attempt to look different when ultimately they're carrying forth the same old politics, simply a new guard replacing an old guard?
The world is showing right now. No, I'm sorry, not the world. The United States is showing right now that that our communities have progressive agendas, right? They are out there. There's a large support for BLM and the BLM movement. And what I found was a lot more white people at the BLM events that I attended than even black people and brown people in some cases, right? We are skewing in that direction. If we want to pander to our communities, we're going to have to force a progressive hand, whether or not we have one. That's just the nature of it, right? If we want to capitalize on this, I also want to say, I want to come back to representation. It's such a big deal with us at Steambox. We interviewed PBS digital innovator Mike Lang from Las Vegas last week on our podcast. And the students were taken back because the students don't have black male teachers in the schools that I'm representing, right? There's just not a lot of them. They exist, but not in the schools that I'm covering. And it was new for them. And a lot of the conversation was about how important representation is, right? Like it's all of your teachers, all of my teachers don't have to be Puerto Rican, but I didn't have a single one. And I bet that could have made a difference, right? I bet that could have made a difference. So as it comes to politics, I think the same rules apply for communities as they do for students in schools. Representation is important. Somebody who's feeling my pain, somebody who's walked a mile in my shoes, those things are important. But at the same time, at the end of the day, we need the most qualified people and the people who are going to kick the most ass for our communities. And it shouldn't be based solely on progressivism. It shouldn't be based solely on the color of somebody's skin. I want to again talk about how important, we talked last week about how important it was that Pawtucket has this wave of women who are coming in and kicking ass over there, right? And multicolored, right? But as it comes to progressivism, I'm thinking about Nathan Bia, and as it comes to representations, I'm thinking of Nathan Bia, who's running against Moira Walsh in Providence, and I've seen things from Nathan Bia that make me say I wouldn't want him representing my community, and I wish I did, because he's a black man. I wish that a black man would step up, right, and run for office in a way that was really dope. And I know we have them, but Nathan Bia is not it. So my point to you is that shouldn't be the sole criteria, but it should certainly be a part of it, right? Representation is important, but that's not enough to be everything. I want to go back to Connolly. Connolly running against Langevin. I've had a lot of success working with Langevin just because the niche of technology. That's Langevin's jam, right? Langevin loves technology. So we've had some success working and partnering with Langevin. I've definitely seen elements that were more conservative than I appreciate, but I also appreciate a lot of the things he brings to the table. But when it comes to Connolly, and if you are running as a Democrat and you are supposedly progressive, and we talked offline about some of the support that Connolly's getting, I'm really confused as to how you can run when in your interview with Uprise Rhode Island, you are labeling the protesters from the Black Lives Matter movement as rioters. Again and again, it wasn't one word, it wasn't a slip of the tongue. He referred to them over and over again as rioters. And he talked about the fear that he had that they would approach his nice neighborhood. That's not the dude. Who's that representing, right? That's not representing progressives at all. That's not representing people of color at all. I want to also warn about the danger of calling everything racist. I know a lot of people think people call everything racist. It is racist to say the Black Lives Matter protesters are rioters, right? When you're not seeing riots and when you're seeing people represent people of color, even if it's not people of color themselves, and you're going to refer to that group as rioters specifically, especially when you're not going to refer to the people who were, representing for Ali, against Ali's Donuts and the people out there with the guns and angry about having to wear masks. Those aren't rioters. Those are like nice, normal people. But when you talk about the Black Lives Matter group, but those are rioters, I mean, this is racism. This is a point of racism. So if you're going to have an interview where your first thing right off the bat is calling these people rioters, you can automatically just go to hell. Sorry, that's my opinion. I'm sure we have a lot of friends in common. I'm sure you're going to be upset, but I can't really see. That's a hard pass for me, dog. What do you think?
Bill, you were going to say something?
Well, I was going to say, the thing is that, you've got to pick an approach, right? You've got to make a decision about, am I going to, less so about progressive, conservative, this, that, the other. Am I going to be basing my campaign, my name, everything I do on independent thought, or am I going to base it on trying to please certain people? So perhaps if you label, BLM protesters or folks who went to a rally or something like that as rioters, in your head, you're thinking, well, great, this mom and this dad and this person who went to this school and has a big fancy job in town might give me money. Because now they think I'm on board with the notion that these protesters are dastardly and we need to stop them because they're dangerous. But the reality is, if you're going to come out as a progressive that is anti-establishment, you've got to go all in on that. You've got to correct all of those difficult or miscategorizations that come from mainstream media, that come from different power brokers, and you should be doing the opposite. First of all, Steve Alquist is an amazing journalist and does great work and so on and so forth. But you need to be in Kathy Gregg's inbox. You need to be in the Boston Globe, Providence Journal, Channel 12, Channel 6, Channel 10. Call in to WPRO. There's 4 shows a day. Call every single one of them as Dylan in Providence, and challenge every single thing all the way, all day, all the way, that is a miscategorization of reality. So rather than going on Uprising, well, these folks are rioters, do the opposite. Go on WPRO and tell Tara Granahan that they're not rioters, that, BLM is not a Marxist organization. You've got to be willing to counter 100% of the time. And if you're not, then you're clearly just playing the game of trying to please everybody. And frankly, that's what a lot of progressivism has become. It's become soft progress, and that's as phony as it gets.
And I'm glad you bring that up, Bill. I mean, Bill, I've always, especially when I was a candidate for governor, really focused on pragmatic solutions, right? And focus was on the person, the human being, right? How do you create economic opportunities for individuals? And I'm just interested because in that whole experience, when I was not included in debates selectively, when even other independent candidates were on that stage, they were white males, there wasn't a single one of the progressive groups, coalitions, that rose up to say anything. Because ultimately, it wasn't so much about the ideas, the change, even the ends. It was more about whether you belong to that tribe. And with hierarchies of power, that's the problem. Tribalism dominates, right? And so, this is ultimately what we have to acknowledge today. Do you want those types of systems to continue? Because if so, if you believe that you want to belong to the progressive tribe, then I think it is important to challenge the individuals within that tribe and to question what they mean by progressivism. We have candidates that are running for offices in Ireland that define themselves as social democrats, that quote Marxist ideology that say that the conditions under which we live and the behaviors that we experience essentially define who we are, our character, and that it really sums into a warfare between two classes, and you either belong to the capitalists or you belong to the workers, and that ultimately, with that understanding, we can understand that the end will be that your value is defined by someone else that will ultimately profit from you. And I get that perspective, but what it doesn't necessarily include are the outliers, right? And when there's a whole book defined, as outliers, which are those individuals that think differently, those individuals that challenge systems, that think outside the box. They created the technology platforms that redefined capital, took it from something that's purely monetary to now something that's social capital, right? Where people are building wealth just basically on selfies. Now, I'm not saying I'm for that, but what I am saying is that, society has evolved. We have evolved. It's not only class tensions, but racial tensions, and frankly, even technology access tensions, right? We can kind of say that it's all about money, but on some level, we've created instruments to make money from nothing. I mean, from a selfie. And the reason I'm pointing all of this out is, when I see candidates running on ideologies that are outdated and attempting to use that as an instrument for rebellion, and this is coming from someone who rebels, my question is, if you're using something that's outdated, then what does your future look like? Because when I think about practical change and the implementation of programs that can ensure pipelines to opportunity, I'm thinking about the future. And I'm not using something that's outdated or lacks, is unable to assimilate in the context that we exist today to define what I'm going to do. I rather, so when someone says, this is the ruler that you can measure me by, I'm a social democrat, what does that mean? Because if that is leaning on Marxist ideology or something again, or Hegel, you can date back to the ancient Greeks if you want. But if that's the ruler that you're measured by, then I would challenge and say, how far does that ruler go into the future? Because it seems pretty short from my perspective. So when we see people say progress, I would much rather the individual that has the courage to think outside the box, to propose things that others haven't proposed, with the end goal obviously being sure that we have an equitable system that works for everyone, then again, someone who's taking an ideology and is assuming that it works in the context of today. So I know that that's super philosophical, but I think it is important from my perspective to not get kind of sucked in to the intellectualism that we're finding on, the kind of far left now, and to assume that if you're not with it, you're not intellectual. That's not necessarily the case. What I would say is, choose whether you want the person that has both the courage, but also the ideas and the practical path to bring those ideas to fruition, or choose the person that stands on ideology, and you can hope and wish that somehow or other there'll be some miracle that transforms that ideology into a practical system. But so far, I would say I haven't ever seen that work. So I'm going to just hand it back to you, Roberto and Bill, and if you want to both kind of summarize what your feelings are around the kind of spectrum of ideas that exist within this progressive umbrella, and then just share what your outrage is. We can start with you, Roberto. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about the local level today, and I look at the national level as it comes to the 2020 election, and people have a choice, right? And it's not as easy, it's not as slam dunk a choice for everyone as you would think, right? Not just for the Trumpers, and not just for the people who like the few things that he does seem to stand for, but also there are people who take their vote as a very serious endorsement and are finding some things troubling with the opposition to Trump, right? Which seems like anybody but Trump. It seems like anybody but Trump is the obvious victor. But I think because of a lot of the things that we talked about, I think what we're finding is that that Biden is actually pandering to some of the progressivism that we talked about today. And what it looks like is really sad. I mean, you remember him talking about the solution so that cops aren't kneeling on people's necks. Well, he should just shoot black people in the cops should shoot black people in the legs instead, right? Like, that's not his joke. Like, that's a thing that he really says and thinks, right? That's our next leader, right? Like, yeah, I struggle with a lot of this. I struggle with even Obama, because I'm looking for a truly progressive source, and not necessarily to the case of progressivism or social progressivism. I'm looking to get money out of politics. I feel like then we can start to. That's a whole nother road, though. But I just wanted to point that out, that it's not just at the local level, at the national level, people, it's not quite the slam dunk for everybody as everybody wants to make it out to be. And I think that's something that we should all be very scared of and very conscious of as we move forward. I want to thank you for giving a shout out to Malcolm Gladwell when we were talking about outliers. I want to give a shout out to Pat Ford, who I think was he was going out and trying out for one of those Patriots COVID roster spots that they have available. So Pat, good luck on the Patriots team. I hope you make it back here. But the thing that has been really bothering me this week is a situation that happened at Fortnite, the bar downtown. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but Councilwoman Kat Kerwin, who is in her very young 20s. We've got a councilwoman in their very young 20s, and she's been able to get a lot of stuff done. She's been very vocal. She is a rebel, like you talked about. And just like anybody in their 20s, just like us in our early 20s, I'm sure she's still learning and evolving as she goes. And she ran into a situation where she was at the spot, the Fortnite spot, and an unusually large number of police came to respond to a noise complaint. And she pointed out that she didn't think it was a coincidence that Fortnite has been all about defund the police and all the other progressivisms, right? All of the other progressive concerns that we've been talking about. There are a lot of signs in there that says, there's one about killing the policeman in your head, right? Like, stop thinking like a police person. And the police officers responded and actually pointed out that they had preconceived notions about the place before they came. So they came looking to fight. They didn't come objective. They came with a whole bunch of police officers looking to shut stuff down that night. And they badgered her. And I know this because I watched a video called Providence City Councilwoman loses her mind and screams at police. And if you watch other videos, you're going to find titles like that. And I was waiting for her to lose her mind. I was waiting for her to scream at police. I think there were a couple of things that she probably wished she phrased differently. Like, it doesn't matter about the noise, stuff like that. Like, we're in the middle of Providence, the noise doesn't really matter, because her concerns were the very obvious reason that the police were actually there. So that situation in itself, that's one thing, but the community response is what's really bothering me. What we're finding is a young woman in the city council, and along political lines, we're finding a lot of real nasty targeting of her. And she's been called every word that you shouldn't call any woman or any person at all this week in very public comments and forums. And it's really gross. It's really showing the worst side of our society right now. And it's embarrassing me as, as a resident of Rhode Island, right? Like, it's really disgusting that we have this many people out there who are so gross to treat somebody like this over a political agenda, right? I'm very discouraged. I'm very disturbed. And at the same time, as a large man, I know that small in stature and very young Kat Kerwin can hold her own. I know she can fight her own battles. I know she doesn't need me to fight her battles. But as somebody who's standing by and watching this stuff, it's really hard to watch people act this gross and not want to intervene. And that's what I'm seeing along a lot of political items. We talked about somebody running earlier and them referencing the Black Lives Matter protesters as rioters. I mean, these things are gross. These things are gross. We need to do better. So those are things that I'm really discouraged about. I don't really have all the answers. I don't recommend punching everybody in the head, although that might be some of our light fantasies. Um, I think we just really need to look in the mirror and figure out the appropriate way that we can interact and engage with people who we don't have the same ideologies. I mean, that's where I am. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'd say my outrage is just that, we live in this time where it's just a binary existence when, look, the reality is, sure, you know, you own a business downtown and you paint, you spray paint a cab on City Hall, you're probably going to be subject to harassment by the cops, or at least a little bit more. That's a choice that you make when you take that risk. But at the same time, you know, the professionalism of the police has to be called into question when you have a noise complaint response with what, 7 units or whatever was showing up. And that incident just highlights the divide we're at now, where, you've got half of the observers of this saying, well, Kat Kerwin, and literally it's so divided, where you see people saying Kat Kerwin is the most brave, outspoken, individualistic person in government in Rhode Island. She, I'm so proud to have her represent my city. And then you have other people who are calling for her resignation as a result of this. So that lack of compromise, that lack of being able to look at both sides of it, is troubling. Now, I'm someone who, as part of my broad strategy, is, look, I don't, institutions by and large, I try to push back on them. I probably would not have used the same language that Counselor Kerwin used in that incident, or taken the same approach of, hey, do you know who I am? I might have tried to more subtly utilize my position, to, you know, try to stand up for what was going on. At the same time, I wasn't there, and I'm not Kat Kerwin. How do I know what's going through her head? So it is a shame that we've gotten to a point where, you've got talk show hosts who are tricking people, frankly, trick Kat Kerwin into calling in today on her talk show, and then use that as an opportunity to make fun of her and tee off on her, and have a litany of, callers kind of rip her, rather than going into a situation and actually getting into a mature discussion of, hey, what went through your head when you stepped out? Would you do it again? How would you, would you say you're going to call, you're calling to defund the police or abolish the police in Counselor Kerwin's case, but at the same time, you're going to call Stephen Parry or Hugh Clements on the phone and have them intervene. So there are ducks out of order on both sides of this. And it's too bad we couldn't talk that out, where both parties could come to an agreement and say, hey, you know what? They spray painted a cab on City Hall. They probably shouldn't have done that from a certain standpoint, but at the same time, they should have done that from a certain standpoint, right? And having a mutual agreement. And I know this is possible. Why? Because a friend of mine who's a police officer in the city wrote to me this weekend. I connected them with Kobe Dennis, and we were able to find, there we go. We were able to find that common ground of, like, here's what, as a police officer in Providence, I'm concerned about. And although I'm someone who supports the movement, I also have these professional responsibilities and a duty to not let all hell break loose. So how can we find that middle ground so we can actually move forward on this, like, immediately, not 5 years from now, but immediately move forward? And I'm with you. I think that the binary version of events that has played out with this Kat Kerwin thing, and by the way, full disclosure, a lot of people know this, Kat Kerwin and I are friends, and even though I don't always agree with everything she says or does, it's still something that I support her rebellious nature, even though the mechanics of it weren't necessarily what I would advise. Had I been there that night, I might have said, just call Clements. Don't walk out and say anything. Say, hey, what's going on here? We're filming this. This is ugly. Call 4 of these units out of here immediately. Let them assess the noise complaint, and let's move on. But what are you going to do?
I wanna point out though
What?
that there is a ringleader to this, and that can be tricky. We do have in our midst here in Rhode Island, we do have somebody who's drumming up this level of hatred and sharing the videos and labeling the videos about how she was screaming. And I'll tell you right now, she was not. They were and making other examples about how she, lost her mind in the videos and lost control. And she did not. She said a couple of things that I think she probably could have expressed better. Absolutely, no doubt. And everything that Bill said, taking a very fair perspective on both sides, very true. But John DePietro is a nasty snake oil salesman right here. I'm not speaking for both of you. I'm not speaking for this show. I'm speaking for myself. And I'm watching him drum up people and his followers get right in line to take turns, almost like that scene in Airplane where everybody lined up to slap the shit out of the person, on the airplane. Everybody lined up to take shots at Kat Kerwin. And again, there is a ringleader. There is somebody responsible for this that's beyond the police and beyond Kat Kerwin's actions that night, right? There's somebody who's leading folks into this nasty shit. And I can't help it. I've got a problem with the John DePietros of this world.
Folks, it is John DePietro. It is the John DePietro show. And Jeepers Crow, how about that Kat Kerwin? And then you've got Go Local Prov as well, bottom of the barrel. You get people like Justin Katz and Mike Stenhouse, and they are ringleaders. And they're following small compared to the rest of the state, but they're loud and they use social media. So it's dangerous. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I mean, it's even Jean Valicenti went after Councilwoman Kerwin. So, we're seeing it even for those that consider themselves to be the polite ones. It is an issue. I will agree with Bill. I do think that when you're in a position of power, sometimes you need to take a step back and make sure you're taking care as to how you wield that power. And I do think that it's fine for leaders to evolve over time and learn those lessons. And hopefully this is a learning lesson. For all the fiscal conservatives out there that are paying attention, why would you want so many police officers to have to go in and, and for a noise complaint?
Yeah.
Right. So if you want to save money and allocate resources appropriately, then maybe we can address that issue as well. But, I just want to get back to this idea of what is progress. And some of these, we're facing big issues in the Rhode Island and throughout the country and in the world. And some of the drama locally happening, it's relatively petty, right? And so the question becomes, like, what battles are we choosing to fight? And specifically, what battles are those that consider themselves progressives choosing to fight? And is there really progress being made for the people? Or is it progress being made for a coalition or a group or a new party? And I just want to continue to beat on that drum, because at the end of the day, I want progress. I will fight for progress, but I will fight even those that are saying that they're progressives, but not fighting for progress. And as we move forward, my outrage continues to be that, we have individuals, some that are rising up, some that are making lateral moves, that continue to say that they want, change, that they want, progress, but ultimately they're failing to understand that you cannot achieve progress if you use the same strategies, the same infrastructure, right? The same consultants. And so whether they're millennials that are doing this, 20-year-olds that are doing this, or even some of the old guard that's trying to now reinvent themselves, it's not working for Rhode Islanders. It just isn't. And I ran when Matt Brown ran, and Matt Brown raised, $80,000 out of nowhere. But I'll tell you right now, the only person that was talking about making healthcare infrastructure changes that would have led to better access, more equitability in that system was me. It wasn't the progressive candidate that had an entire progressive movement behind him. And so this is not about Matt Brown as an individual. This is Matt Brown, the representation of what progressivism was in 2018. So I just want to put that out there because, again, as we move forward, there are those of us that are coming up, grassroots, community advocates. Doesn't matter how many degrees, all that doesn't matter. Just individuals that are rising up to represent the people that you may find yourself, if you're listening, as one of those candidates that wants progress, but for some reason or other, you don't want to take the litmus test. You wouldn't even pass the litmus test. I would say don't give up. Push forward. There are those of us that, yes, fall along the independent line, but we still can be held accountable to values. We don't need a ruler based on an outdated ideology, right? We're trying to set a path to the future. So I'll leave everyone with that. Thank you so much to my co-host, Mr. Bill Bartholomew, Mr. Roberto Gonzalez, for helping address and tackle this challenging issue and for bringing up some important circumstances that have transpired over the past week here in Rhode Island. As always, here on the Pump Up the Volume, we are amplifying the voices of community, bringing up issues that challenge the status quo, all for the betterment of you, the people. Thank you so much. Join us next Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Take care.
You too.